This weekend we have a live-action Masters of the Universe movie, but does it have the power? Now, before I begin, I should probably establish where I'm coming from, because I think that's important with a property like this. Obviously, I did not grow up with Masters of the Universe. I've never watched the original cartoon, I don't have any nostalgia for He-Man, I wasn't sitting there comparing every costume, or every line of dialogue, or every plot point to the source material, because I'm not all that familiar with the source material. My only exposure to it before now was the memes and the 1987 live-action movie that I reviewed last week. So I'm reviewing this as a 28-year-old who is going in almost completely fresh. And that's part of why the movie is frustrating, because on paper it should have worked. Because the director previously made Bumblebee, which I really enjoyed. Bumblebee took another toy-based 1980s property, and somehow managed to create a movie that had heart, likable characters, fun action, and enough respect for the source material to satisfy fans, while still being accessible to newcomers. So naturally, when I heard he was directing another live-action adaptation of Disney's cartoon Twilight, I thought, okay, this could be good. Unfortunately, I think the movie suffers from major identity crisis. The entire time I was watching it, I kept thinking about Marvel movies. Specifically, Thor, Thor Ragnarok, Thor Love and Thunder, and pretty much the entire Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. And from a visual standpoint, He-Man's world feels very similar to Asgard. The costumes, the architecture, the cosmic fantasy aesthetic, it constantly reminded me of Marvel's version of fantasy worlds. And even some of the mythology surrounding the magical object that grants the hero his powers feels familiar. You have the chosen hero with a magical weapon, ancient prophecies, a mythical power source. I'm sitting there thinking, this feels less like Masters of the Universe, and more like someone combined Thor and Guardians of the Galaxy, and that's kind of the problem, because the movie rarely feels like it has its own identity. Instead of taking what makes Masters of the Universe unique, it feels like it keeps taking what worked in Marvel movies and then copying that. And nowhere is that more obvious than with the characters. The way they write He-Man, he feels very similar to Star-Lord. Tila feels like Gamora. The robot sidekick whose name I can't remember is basically a combination of Rocket Raccoon and Groot, because they make sarcastic comments and jokes, and then they're also kind of the muscle, and then Man-at-Arms also feels like Drax, because he's this big muscular warrior who also functions as the team's lovable idiot. And that creates a lot more problems, because if Man-at-Arms is supposed to be protecting the king and queen, then why is he constantly portrayed as being kind of a moron? The movie wants him to be both the elite warrior and the comic relief, and those two ideas don't work together that well. There were multiple scenes where I felt like I was watching Guardians of the Galaxy rather than He-Man. Even the structure of the film follows Marvel formulas. There's a big morale-boosting speech before the final battle that almost felt beat for beat like Star-Lord's speech from the first film. There are slow-motion teamwalk sequences. There are needle drops from rock bands like Queen. There are scenes where characters pause dramatic moments specifically to make jokes. And every time the movie starts building momentum, it stops to remind me of another franchise. Now, surprisingly, Skeletor and Evil Lyn are the best part of the movie. But when Jared Leto is the best part of your movie, you know you've screwed up. You know something has gone very wrong. But, credit where credit is due, Jared Leto absolutely commits to Skeletor. He's not one of those modern villains where they spend half the movie trying to convince you that he's secretly misunderstood. They don't write him as tragic or sympathetic or morally gray. He's evil simply for the fact that he just enjoys being evil, and honestly, that was refreshing. He gives dramatic monologues, he throws baby tantrums when things don't go his way, he kills his own henchmen for no reason, he cackles with glee, he dramatically switches his cape, he exaggerates every vowel, he rolls up a yaw! He acts like a cartoon villain brought to life, and you can tell that Jared Leto is having absolute fun with this. And Alison Brie is also clearly enjoying herself. The villains understand exactly what kind of movie they're in. Unfortunately, the heroes often feel like they're trapped in a completely different movie. And that leads into one of my biggest criticisms. I have absolutely no idea who the movie is supposed to be for. I have no idea who the target audience for this movie is. And what I mean by that is it's PG-13, and it really earns the rating because there's a surprising amount of language, there are repeated sexual innuendos, and crass jokes throughout the film. And one of the major running jokes involves characters making jokes about He-Man's sword being a substitute for the part that classifies you as male. So I'm not going to say exactly because it's a family-friendly channel, but you know what I'm saying when I say what the sword is an innuendo for. And they keep repeating that joke over and over and over again. and there are numerous other jokes built around similar innuendos. It feels like we're watching something like Saturday Night Live, like this is an SNL parody sketch about He-Man rather than an actual He-Man movie. So I wouldn't say it's family-friendly at all. It is not for kids. It is a little too crass, which is quite a shame, because this could have been a really fun family movie, a really fun sci-fi fantasy adventure movie, right, with the adults who grew up with He-Man going to take their kids to see this and share them they love it, but they can't because it's really, really crass. And its identity crisis is really obvious, because it feels like two different writers had two completely different ideas for what they wanted the movie to be. It feels like one of the writers wanted a somewhat faithful adaptation, something that was campy, fun, and embraces the campiness, but the other writer wanted, like, this parody, satire, self-aware humor. Like, there's parts of the characters making fun of the villains' names, like Trapjaw and Fisto, and they wanted jokes about how ridiculous the premise and the world are. They wanted to completely point out how little sense the world of it makes, and instead of picking one of those ideas, it tries to do both. And so it feels like a film that's just constantly fighting against itself, because one scene wants you to take mythology a bit more seriously, and then the next scene they're making fun of the mythology. One scene wants you to feel emotionally invested, and then the next scene is undercutting itself with a joke. One scene kind of embraces the camp, but then the next scene takes it way too seriously, and it's exhausting. And the first act also felt oddly familiar, because its basic setup, it's basically Superman. The young hero is sent to Earth after his world comes under attack from the evil villain. Now, obviously there are differences, but the broad story beats of the first act at least felt surprisingly similar, and that trend continues throughout the movie. The entire thing just feels like a collection of ideas you've seen in other superhero movies. Superman, Thor, Guardians of the Galaxy, Suicide Squad. Like, there are moments where the movie literally does those slow-motion group walk shots at the classic rock songs, and I think was James Gunn was involved with this, wasn't he? But he wasn't, but that's what it feels like. It feels like they're trying to copy James Gunn. So I started wondering, like, what were they thinking when they did this? Like, they don't do anything that makes it feel special or different or stand apart. It just feels very assembly line and made by committee. And I don't want to sound entirely negative, because there are things I enjoyed. For the most part, the action is decent, has good production values, has pretty good visual effects, and like I said, Jared Leto and Alison Brie are the most entertaining parts of the movie, and there are moments where the movie decides to embrace the ridiculous, and it can be genuinely fun, but it's also frustrating because then you can see a much better movie that this could have been. This could have been this big, colorful, unapologetically cheesy fantasy adventure, and I wish the entire movie had committed more to that tone. But instead, it just feels too safe, it feels too calculated, it feels too assembly line, it feels too written by committee, it feels way too laser-focused on copying the MCU, and especially too afraid to fully embrace what makes Masters of the Universe weird. It didn't make me angry and I wasn't bored. I just left very, very confused. Because there was a lot of potential here, but it's a movie that just feels unsure of itself, unsure of its audience, and just unsure of what it wants the end result to be. And honestly, I guess it's fitting that He-Man's tiger sidekick is named Cringer, because cringe was pretty much my reaction to a lot of the jokes in this movie. So overall, it's just okay. It wasn't horrible, but it wasn't amazing. It was just okay. The villains were entertaining, some of the action was fun, and there were a few genuinely enjoyable moments every once in a while, but it's held back by an identity crisis, its storytelling is derivative, and it just is trapped by the sense that it's desperately trying to copy the MCU. So I'm giving it a C-, a 7 out of 10, and a 3.5 out of 5 stars. For me, you can go ahead and stream this when it hits Amazon Prime. If you're a longtime He-Man fan, you might think differently than I do. Maybe you'll appreciate it more than I did. But as someone who came in fresh, I walked away feeling like I'd seen a lot of other movies before, and most of them did the ideas a lot better.